The letter arrived on a morning so ordinary that nothing could have predicted how sharply my life was about to twist. I woke up late, knocked over the only mug I owned, stared at my reflection in the cracked mirror wondering if 32 was too early to feel exhausted by existence, and finally dragged myself toward the front door to check if the mailman had once again shoved advertisements under my doormat. But instead of a pizza flyer or an electricity bill, I found a thick cream-colored envelope with my name written in an elegant cursive I had never seen before. And for a moment I thought it must be junk mail because no one who knew me would write my name with that kind of flourish. Yet the weight of the envelope, the texture of the paper, and the faint scent of something old like cedar or forgotten attics made it impossible to dismiss. Inside, printed on heavy parchment, was a formal notice declaring that I, Adrian Wells, had been named the beneficiary of the estate of Henry C. Wells, a man whose name rang absolutely no bells in my memory, accompanied by a handwritten note clipped to the top, Adrian, if you're reading this, then I failed to find you in my lifetime. I hope you will forgive me. That sentence clung to me for the rest of the day like a wet coat, refusing to let me breathe normally. I went to work, tried to answer emails, tried to concentrate on insurance claims that felt increasingly pointless. But the letter sat folded in my pocket like a pulse, beating against my leg every time I moved, whispering questions I couldn't ignore. Who was Henry? Why me? What forgiveness did he want? And by evening, I had convinced myself that normal people didn't simply inherit mysterious estates from strangers, unless something had been wrong, hidden, stolen, or forgotten. So I packed a bag with far fewer clothes than I probably needed, bought the cheapest bus ticket to Somerset County, and began a journey toward a truth I didn't know I was ready for. When I arrived, night had swallowed the sky, and an iron-gated mansion stood at the end of a long gravel path like something from a novel I'd skimmed in school, its towering gables silhouetted against the moon, its windows dark except for one faint light glowing near the entrance where a thin, tall man in an overcoat stood waiting. Barrister Elijah Rowan, the man whose name had been printed on the envelope. He greeted me with a politeness that seemed to rehearsed, led me inside the cold, dust-scented interior of Wells Manor, and explained with an unsettling calmness that Henry C. Wells had been desperate to find me before his death because, as Rowan put it with the gentleness of someone delivering a blow, Henry was my grandfather, which made absolutely no sense since I had grown up believing my parents who died in a car crash when I was 12 were my biological ones. But Rowan insisted my adoption had been kept secret for reasons of safety, though he avoided explaining safety from what. He gave me another letter written by Henry himself shortly before dying, the shaky handwriting full of regret. I never meant to abandon you. I never meant to leave your mother alone. I hoped one day I would be brave enough to face what happened. Those words tore something open inside me, and Rowan, seeing my disbelief, showed me an old photograph from a dusty drawer. My mother, Evelyn Wells, cradling a newborn. I realized with a jolt was me yet before I could ask anything else. A woman appeared in the hallway, startling both of us. Her hair was silver, her eyes sharp with suspicion, and she introduced herself curtly as Margaret Gray, the manor's longtime housekeeper. And judging by the way she looked at me, half pity, half warning, she knew far more than she intended to say. But Rowan dismissed her with a nod, and continued explaining that the Wells bloodline had been marked by tragedy, secrecy, and a feud that began long before my birth. I spent the night in a guest room where the wallpaper peeled like shedding skin. The wind howled through cracks in the window frame, and I couldn't sleep because somewhere in the house, something or someone kept pacing, slow and rhythmic, like the memory of footsteps. The next morning, Rowan brought me to Henry's private study, a room my grandfather had locked and refused to let even the staff enter during his final years. And as sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, illuminating dust spirals, I spotted journals on the desk, each dated, each stamped with the initials HCW and filled with frantic, looping script describing how my mother had been targeted by her own relatives, when she defied family expectations by falling in love with a man beneath her social class. How she had run away with him. How Henry had tried to intervene, but had been too late to prevent a tragedy. That Rowan still refused to explain. As I read, a coldness seeped into my bones. A feeling that something in this house was still alive, some secret or someone. And my suspicion intensified when Margaret pulled me aside in the hallway with trembling hands, whispering that not everything Henry wrote should be trusted and that I should leave before the shadows remember you, which made me wonder if grief had twisted her mind, or if the Wells family truly had skeletons that were not metaphorical. That evening, a storm rolled in as Rowan gathered me in the drawing room for what he called the full truth. And with rain hammering the windows, he explained that my mother, Evelyn, had died under mysterious circumstances shortly after giving birth to me. And although the official report said it was an accident, Henry had always believed someone in the family was responsible. Fearing for my life, he had arranged for my adoption through anonymous channels, ensuring that no one in the Wells family would know where I had gone. But his guilt consumed him for decades, driving him into isolation, paranoia, and eventually madness, which Margaret had mistaken for possession or haunting because Henry insisted someone was still searching for me, someone dangerous. Listening to Rowan felt like peeling off old bandages from wounds I never knew I had. But before I could process anything, we heard a loud crash echo through the manor. Margaret screamed from somewhere upstairs, and Rowan and I rushed to find her collapsed in the hallway near a shattered mirror, muttering, "He's back! He's back!" before she fainted, and although Rowan dismissed it as stress, I felt an icy prickle at the back of my neck because I could have sworn I saw movement in the fractured reflection of the mirror, something shaped like a man. After Margaret was placed in her room to rest, Rowan insisted we resume our discussion. And that was when he revealed the most unsettling truth yet. I wasn't the only potential heir. Henry had had a brother, Charles Wells, whose descendants had been banished from the family decades ago due to a violent dispute involving money, land, and accusations of sabotage. And although that branch of the family had disappeared from public records, Henry believed they had resurfaced under new identities and were still seeking revenge. Suddenly, everything, the secrecy, the adoption, the guilt, made sense. But the revelation came with a warning: if Charles's descendants learned Henry had left his entire estate to me, I would become their target. Overwhelmed, I tried to leave the manor the next morning, but the roads were flooded from the storm, the bus services suspended,
and Rowan insisted I stay at least until Henry's will was officially read. That night, as I lay awake again, I heard footsteps outside my door. Slow, heavy, deliberate, and when I opened the door, the hallway was empty except for a slight draft and the faint smell of cologne, familiar somehow, though I couldn't place it. Shaken, I returned to Henry's study the next morning to read more of his journals, where I discovered entries describing a man who had visited Henry weeks before his death. A man who claimed to be part of the family, who demanded Henry reveal my whereabouts, who threatened to finish what was begun decades ago. Henry never wrote the man's name, only calling him the ghost of our sins. But in the margins he had scribbled frantic warnings: protect Adrian, protect the bloodline. They will come. I felt my heartbeat hammer in my ribs like a trapped bird. And when I confronted Rowan about the visitor, he grew pale and insisted he had never heard of such a person. But his eyes flickered with something, fear or guilt, I couldn't tell. Hours later, Margaret regained consciousness long enough to reveal that she had seen a man lurking around the estate recently. A man who looked remarkably like the younger Wells men in the portraits, a sharp jawline, gray eyes, the unmistakable family features, but she insisted he wasn't a ghost. He was flesh and blood, and he had been watching the manor from the woods. The revelation tore through my nerves like lightning, and for the first time since stepping through the iron gates, I considered calling the police, but Rowan stopped me, warning that involving outsiders might provoke the hidden branch of the family and escalate the danger. which sounded insane yet somehow believable. The next morning, the tension finally snapped when Rowan called me urgently to the library. Henry's will had been tampered with, the sealed envelope ripped open, and pages rearranged as if someone had been searching for something specific. As Rowan and I examined the scene, the front door slammed open downstairs, followed by the sound of footsteps, heavy, confident, unhurried, and then a voice echoed through the manor, deep and familiar in a way that made my blood turn to frost. "Adrian Wells, you're harder to find than I expected." Rowan stepped in front of me protectively as a man emerged from the shadows, a tall figure with gray eyes and a smirk that carried generations of resentment, and introduced himself as Julian Hart, great-grandson of Charles Wales, claiming the inheritance rightfully belonged to his side of the family, and accusing Henry of hiding me to steal what belonged to them. Rowan argued, insisting the will had been legally authenticated, but Julian ignored him and stared directly at me, saying Henry had destroyed his ancestors' lives and that by accepting the inheritance, I was continuing the cycle of theft. His words twisted inside me because I didn't want the manor, the estate, or any of this madness. I simply wanted answers about my mother, about the past, about why Henry had abandoned me, but Julian had no interest in truth, only revenge. Things escalated quickly when he lunged at Rowan, but before he could injure him, Margaret appeared behind Julian with a fireplace poker and struck him across the back, giving us enough time to escape and lock ourselves in Henry's study. Though the lock wouldn't hold for long, Rowan, breathing heavily, handed me one final envelope Henry had left sealed with instructions that it be opened only in the moment of greatest danger, and inside was a confession. Henry admitted that Charles had not been wrongfully banished. He had been banished because he had attempted to kill Evelyn after she refused to marry into a family alliance designed purely for wealth. Henry had feared Charles would target me next, so he hid me through adoption, but in doing so, he had ignited a generational war of resentment. The letter ended with a plea: "Adrian, do not let the past bind you. Leave this place. Build your own life. The inheritance is a curse, not a blessing." As I read the final line, Julian broke through the study door, furious, but Rowan managed to subdue him long enough for the police finally called by Margaret to arrive, and Julian was taken away screaming about his legacy, about blood, about debts never paid. After hours of questioning, I stood outside Wells Manor at dawn, watching sunlight bleed across the sky, turning the once menacing mansion into something almost peaceful, and Rowan, exhausted but relieved, told me the choice was now mine: keep the estate and risk the anger of others who believed it belonged to them, or renounce it entirely and walk away. Henry's last words echoed inside me, heavy with truth. And although the idea of having a family legacy was tempting, I knew it was a legacy built on pain, fear, betrayal, and secrets. So I chose freedom. I renounced the estate, donated the mansion to the county as a historic site, and walked away carrying only the journals, the photograph of my mother, and the knowledge that my identity was not defined by the shadows of a family I never knew. Now, months later, living in a quiet apartment far from Somerset County, I sometimes look in Henry's final letter, wondering if forgiveness ever reached him, wondering if he found peace in knowing I survived. And so the past still flickers at the edges of my mind like a candle in the dark. I tell myself the same thing every time: the inheritance letter wasn't meant for the person I used to be, but maybe, in some strange way, it was meant for the person I became afterward.